Hi there. I know that I said that speculation about metaphysics was unhelpful and even to extent of being forbidden. And here I am speculating about the characteristics of what heaven could be, or what heaven could be like. And I've come up with a whole list of things actually. There's quite a lot of data really. And these are pieces of data which I think are actually known. It's a bit like in physics. There are a lot of things which are known about subatomic particles. They are known on the blackboard or the whiteboard. They are known through theoretical inquiry, and they're mathematically represented, even though these particles have yet to be identified. But actually, a lot of them have already been identified. And when they were identified, the mathematics was actually justified. It was actually, it was actually proven. So, whilst none of these characteristics of heaven, even supposing heaven does exist, and we'll come back to that in another video, it's actually 11 characteristics, all of which seem to make logical sense, and all of which have perhaps been gained from some kind of actual numinous experience, some kind of inner knowing, and have been gleaned from various sources, really. But it is interesting because beyond this particular data, all speculation sort of seems to break down. And although these various characteristics could logically account for further characteristics of heaven, what it would be like to live in heaven, when you get down to it, eventually it all breaks down. So heaven does remain ineffable. It does remain beyond words to describe. And yet we've got a sort of 11 characteristics here, sort of happily bouncing around the place, and saying, look at me, and feeling pretty pleased with themselves. I mean, for example, a complete understanding of all the worlds. I would have thought that would have been a characteristic, having returned home, as it were, or souls having returned home. There would be an understanding. I mean, having experienced so much of all the worlds, you put all the data together, the various souls, millions of souls, or one soul with millions of parts. If you put it all together, you would have a complete understanding. And therefore, heaven would be a sphere of meaning, because suddenly it would all become meaningful. Suddenly, the three blind men would be able to see the elephant in the room, and not just the tail and the trunk and the legs. They'd be able to see the whole picture. And this would be an incredibly powerful experience to be able to understand everything as a result of having experienced everything. As I say, all this is speculation. And you could go through each one of these, and timelessness, for example. That's an interesting thing because I always think that, as you get older, time gets less and less, and the days whip by faster and faster, and you're left staggering really as to where the days do go. So timeless would be lovely, if you had all the time in infinity to do things. Whether do things would be the right phrase, really. I mean, a place where focus is easy, where mental focus is easy, where there are no distractions. Interesting. Divine abundance. This is a big thing because if a characteristic of the world to the demiurge is finiteness and scarcity, and this accounts for all the imperfection and all the suffering that we experience, then infinite abundance would be something which would be quite incredible to experience. And a lot of the problems that we experience in the lower worlds wouldn't be experienced if there was infinite abundance. And what sort of experience would there be? I mean, go like playing a computer game, like playing No Man's Sky forever. Um, visiting 9 quintillion worlds, and beyond the galaxy as well, even 9 quintillion more. Certainly, you never get bored anyway, as you go around in your cosmic spaceship, experiencing the whole multiverse, and to do it with total objectivity. So there's no. What I mean by this is there's no emotional response to anything. Well, there's no over emotionality anyway, and so therefore, nothing would freak you out basically too much, which would be kind of handy, because there'd be a lot of things that would potentially freak you out unless you had live in a sphere of total objectivity, where everything is intuition rules, and true intuition rules the day, rules your consciousness, rather than false beliefs and fantasies and fear of the dark and fear of shadows. They'd all be gone. All that fear would be gone. A sphere of synchronicity, incredible, and acausality. You can hardly sort of imagine what that might be like. Everything just a stream of consciousness, and everything linking up with everything else in an acausal way. We can't really imagine that either. With friends, having befriended reality, you are then with friends. I don't know about that. It seems to be a bit of a strange speculation. Point of, I would say that's probably a fantasy. Fully established in self. Again, we'll come back to that. I'm not quite sure whether that's possible, or whether that's even, what would that be like? And so thought and energy, everything that you think becomes true, which is in the sphere of the forms, that would be certainly true, whether that actually could be experienced. So you see a lot of these points, I mean, they either, we sort of say, well, what would that be like? And we can't say. And some of them we kind of would say that doesn't sound very likely, very probable. But everything that is improbable, of course, becomes probable, or becomes possible, inevitable, actually. So a lot of the things that we say now are impossible become inevitable in heaven, which is another characteristic. But again, how would you ever experience? How could that be experienced? So a lot of these points, although they seem, when I wrote them down, they seemed good at the time. When you actually reflect on them later, you begin to think, well, either it would be impossible to experience these things as I'm presently constituted, as my sort of consciousness. As my consciousness is capable of experiencing things now, I don't think I could experience any of these characteristics, really. I'd have to be something completely different. And then what would be left of my I consciousness then? All that these things would be are basically impossible in any universe. So, but what is the nature of possibility when you're talking about another reality? So I'm not sure whether the question, and again, I actually, in the end, in a third video, I actually question the whole thing. What is heaven? What would heaven be like? I actually, in the end, reject that question for various technical reasons. So when you reject the question, you can't ask the question. Then you're unlikely to get an answer. It's like if you don't do the lottery, you're unlikely to win it. Well, if you can't ask if the question itself makes no sense, then obviously there's no answer that could possibly answer the question, if you see what I mean. So I'm not sure whether these 11 characteristics of heaven are really going to get us any further. I suppose contemplating these characteristics could actually tell you more about yourself and more about the lower worlds and the finite worlds than they actually could about heaven. Because if you think about it, um, these characteristics are almost they almost beg questions of the reality of which we are sensible now, actually. So in that sense, this exercise hasn't been completely a waste of time, and this video is not a waste of your time. But I don't know. Some of the things kind of arise logically, as I say, like infinite abundance, timelessness. Those characteristics seem to me to be the only ones possible given what we know about this world and this dimension. And what we're doing really is just sort of saying it's the opposite. Everything is the opposite to what we have now. But why would one assume that? Things might not be opposite, they might be completely different. And different is not the same as opposite, you see. So heaven could be completely different from this dimension, but just reversing everything and saying instead of finite abundance we have infinite abundance. That might not be enough. So you can see that the imagination is fraught with with inaccuracies and self-contradiction. Whereas to have gnosis is to have knowledge, and to have gnosis, perhaps, of what heaven is like, is obviously going to be a lot better than all this conjecture. And even though I think some of the characteristics could be derived from, or could have been derived from gnosis, and perhaps some people have said they've had direct knowledge of these things, and therefore they are true. Otherwise, you could say, well, they've just been sort of, these characteristics have been dreamed up through sort of logic, through imagination. But it could be just like seeing canals on Mars, seeing things which aren't there, and coming up with characteristics that just don't make any sense, actually, which a lot of these don't. They don't make any sense in any dimension, let alone any other dimension apart from this one. Because they just seem to be logically impossible and self-contradictory. So anyway, but as I said, this question, what would heaven be like, actually probably tells us more about the person asking the question, and more about the dimension they're asking the question in, rather than answering the actual question, which seems a bit daffy to me. But anyway, we're just left with that, really, and we're left with a big old question mark in the end when we're using our rational minds.